So, playing game approach, or the playing game model.
So this is another model that's been, there are key concepts like action perception loop has been floating around for a long time as possible alternatives to what I call the cognitivistic model or Cartesian tradition, what have you. Whereas the action perception loop is indebted to perhaps Heidegger, or at least certain interpretation very highly influenced by Wittgenstein, that can drive this case. In this case, we are kind of jumping ahead about 30, 40 years to possible to philosophy. The main references here in my mind are certain texts by Nietzsche, Gadamer, and Franchi. So, what I'll be doing is first talk a little bit about playing a game, because actually there is no clear, there is no common view about playing a game. Not at all. So I'll give you my view. Then I will very briefly oppose it to the model we've seen before, the action perception loop. Then I will try to show or to hint at, since we have very good time left, which
no, we
experience.
have time left.
Yeah.
So
that's why. Although my suitcase is hostage in the reception area.
I'll go and get it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's getting in work.
Yeah. Where is your
it's in the reception area. Yeah, there is just one little suitcase.
Upstairs, next where the people were standing.
Right. So that's
okay, I'll get it. All right.
And then finally, I will mention the notion of passivity, which I think is what's needed, as I was saying before, in order to go beyond, or rather, in order to capture what escapes the playing game approach. All right, so I will start with playing game. Now, what I want to say is that, well, here I am at the same time hostage of English language and exploiting it. Hostage because in Western European languages, English is the only one which has two different words for a range of phenomena, right? We have spiel, we have jeu, we have wiggle, we have jocko, but then in English we have play and game. So, are these two different phenomena, or is it just one unified phenomenon? There are different approaches you can take. If you read the literature, which is not very abundant, but the literature on these issues, for example, Huizinga or Calois or other theoreticians, there is kind of discomfort with this distinction. The best you can come up with is that there is some kind of continuum somehow, with game at one end and play at the other end in the English terminology. Now, what are the poles of this continuum? This is not my view, so I would try to say that it's not a continuum, actually. But for the sake of the argument now, what are the poles of this continuum? Now, on the one hand, you have what in English you call games. A typical example here is chess. Chess is the prototypical game, board game. It is a very rigidly structured environment, which there are rules, which are absolute commands, as Feynman put it. It is, you cannot forget them, you cannot forgo them unless you take yourself out of the game. Right? You play chess, you cannot decide during the chess game that you're going to move your pawn as a queen. If you do that, of course no one can prevent you from doing it, but you're taking yourself out of the game, you're no longer playing. And this is the kind of idea that we use when we talk of, in English, for example, of war games. So we refer to war as a game, or to love, another very common metaphor, as a game, right? There are a very fixed set of rules which you have to obey. On the other hand, so the other opposite pole of the spectrum, you have the kind of free-flowing activities, and here dance is the prototypical example, or playing music, because in English there is a very interesting association. You can use the word play, also this is in German as well, for music. In my mind, the most typical activity of this kind is the children playing the playground. Right? It's a kind of free-flowing activity that has no fixed rules. At least we do not perceive them as fixed rules. It's just going with the flow. It's just improvising, etc., etc. Now, typically, when we use this kind of metaphors coming from mathematics, we refer to games, and this for Neumann-Morgenstern is the canonical example. We use game and play in the first meaning, right? In chess, again, is always proposed as an example. And the kind of mathematics that is used is, at least the vocabulary that's used, comes from discrete mathematics. It's group theory, basically, that's what it is. So you have objects, operators define those objects, and the set that this object form is closed. Is any operation on the object will again give you a member of the set. It's a set plus closed set plus operation. Now here already there is an interesting problem that comes up. That is, if you think of the first pole, the gain pole of the spectrum, it seems that you cannot have a completely deterministic game. Right? Think of a chess game in which at any given step in your game you only have one option. Right? You would not perceive that probably as a very enjoyable game. Right? Or so it seems. Right? It is. It would be like a mechanism. That's a machine that you are thrown into. It's not a game. In that kind of, at that point of the spectrum, freedom is experienced, and Shinwei was referring to this earlier on. I can't remember now whether it was in the morning or the afternoon. In terms of decision trees, right? You have to have options at the various nodes in the tree. But now notice things start to get interesting. At the other pole of the spectrum, the play pole of the spectrum, we speak of freedom precisely when we have no other choice. That is, think of the child swinging on the swing, right? Which option does the child have besides swinging or not swinging? Right? If the child swings, then she goes with the swing, and it's just one degree of freedom. That is, she swings back and forth. But we use that pole, that lack of freedom, so to speak, in one meaning, as an example of great freedom. As an example of really being free or being freed from something. So freedom in play space, in a certain sense, I think we can distinguish two different notions of freedom here. And I think this has something to do with, or at least I will try to use these notions, speaking about the T-gardens, of freedom too, is freedom to do something. And this notion of freedom that we use when we talk about decision trees, chess games, state spaces, all different terminology for the same phenomenon, basically, in which we have the choice of states, or possible alternative state, against, as opposed to totally deterministic spaces in which there is just one possible path from the starting state to the end. But we speak of freedom from, in a certain sense, when we have necessary rules, again, one degree of freedom in the case of the swing, which in a certain sense, letting oneself go, to put it the way Gadamer puts it, letting yourself be absorbed by the game, frees you from the burden of choice. It frees you from the real world, the everyday world in which you are constantly faced with the necessity to make choices. And therefore you escape to a higher realm in which that choice is no longer necessary, and therefore you experience as free. And this is, I won't go into this, but of course in the philosophical literature, as you probably know, there is a lot of, in the recent philosophical literature, at least from my perspective, the last 100 years, there's a lot of debate on this issue, starting with Nietzsche, on this false dichotomy between freedom and necessity. The realm of play in this end of the spectrum is precisely seen as the realm in which this dichotomy breaks apart. You are free and you are necessitated at the same time. Now, what I want to say is that game and play, so these two poles, are both present. Not only that, but actually, I'm using here a borrowing term from Hofstadter, an entangled hierarchy. They are constantly present within the same phenomenon. It's not that you have one-dimensional continuum, and given any specific instance, you can place it anywhere on this continuum. You have all the elements of both present within the same phenomenon. That seems to be the only possible solution to the complex phenomenology that games or playing games offer. All right. Now, play and immanence. I was insisting when reading Helga's contribution to the point of transcendence. Right? In the actual perceptual loop model, there's always this transcendence of the organism with respect to the environment, or the other way around, depends on where you put yourself. Of course, playing games are precisely the realm of immanence. There is nothing outside the game. Now, this is in trivial algebraic sense because the set is closed. So there is nothing outside the set. Any transformation keeps you within the set. Games are closed upon themselves in the sense that the universe of play is closed, self-sufficient, and autonomous. Whatever meaningfulness you find when you play, you find within the game, not because you play for some other purposes. Right? And that's, in fact, one of the typical distinctions between labor, on the one hand, and play. Right? Play is what you don't need to do. You don't need to make a living, and so on and so forth. Is that it? Okay, great, thank you. So, self-contained and immanence. Games are never transcendent to the player, I was saying. In fact, it's just the other way around. Meaning is always given on the inside. Here is, I know, I'm kind of very nervous because this Patrician word. I'm trying to paraphrase some kind of structuralist dictum here. There is no meaning of meaning was one of the keyword 50 years ago, or 40 years ago. Meaning is always given, or meaningfulness is always given on the inside, from within the structure or the system, as it was called earlier on. Whatever you find, whatever the source of enjoyment has to be found from within the system, and in fact, your position within the system is given by the system itself. So, games are the realm of immanence. Now, it was a very short account, but hopefully some of the points will be clear. Apply this to the tea garden or the other immersive, some of the other immersive environments. Remember, the question that motivated us from the beginning was trying to find out what does it mean to be to have certain kind of experience within an immersive environment. We said at the beginning, we didn't argue, we said that you cannot account for those experiences in terms of the cognitivistic model. You cannot really account for those experiences in terms of the actual perceptual loop model with a very small perception. Now, I think we can account for more of those experiences, for more aspects of those experiences in terms of playing game. And this is because, in fact, there are complex rules. It's a well-regulated space. Even if these rules are non-transparent, as we saw how important this was for the previous model, these rules are complex and they are rule-like. They are, even if they are not totally deterministic, they are perceived as rule-like. The content of the rule may be obscure, but that there is a rule is quite clear to the participant. This is how I see what goes on for most of the players. There is the very fact that they know that there is some kind of complex technological apparatus in the background is perceived as a warranty of some rule-like regularity in the environment itself. Now closure. Closure seems to me another very important thing, although probably not all of the environments of the installation you guys have built do respect this requirement. But in the D-garden, I think it's quite clear. It's closed, the environment is closed at a very different level. It's closed because it is sold, so to speak, as such, right? I mean, you are dressed up as you know, with this very sophisticated costume, and then you enter the environment, then you exit the environment. There is a very clear-cut separation between what goes inside and what goes on inside and what goes on outside. Now, I remember some street installations in which become transparent. I don't know whether these are actually being built or are still in the planning phase. This does not happen. And I would be curious to see whether the same kind of play-like experience actually do happen when closure lasts. My guess would be that they don't, but perhaps I'm wrong. And finally, the immanent enjoyment, that is, the kind of satisfaction, phenomenological satisfaction that the participant receives, is fully contained within the environment itself. I mean, in that sense, it is perceived as a playful environment. It's not as different as dancing in the tea garden is not as different to, let's say, playing chess. It's more different to, it's more similar to walking in the street than it is to playing chess. That's the kind of claim I'm putting forward here. It's closer to playing chess, I actually said it backward. It's closer to playing chess than it is to walking in the street. However, the tea garden spaces perhaps are not so immersive. This is actually an open question that I'm asking here. So what I said is that the tea garden spaces are immersive in the gameplay sense because of these three conditions. Now, can we prove, can in a certain sense use, and I'm going back here to the idea of using the old work guys as a test bed for our ideas. Can we prove that with an assertion by designing spaces that break the playful requirements? These spaces, for example, in which there are no complex rules. This may be the most difficult one to break. But for example, spaces which are not closed, in which there is no clear-cut distinction between an inside and outside, which is this kind of smooth distinction between the inside and the outside. And I was thinking when I was writing this about the straight installations, in which there is something different. I mean, the environment is the usual one with something added, but that something that's added disrupts the normal interaction. At that point, it's impossible to make a clear-cut distinction because you're not asking the participants to leave their regular everyday life behind and somehow play at being dancers or playing at being themselves while dancing, but you're asking them to go on with their regular everyday life while taking into account what goes on.
That's where it starts to challenge Bazinga
Right.
and Kalwana, those kind of.
Right, so here is the last one. Are the street installations example of such a space, or are there other ideas? Now, so far so good, it is. It seems that the play game model captures a lot, at least in my idea of what goes on. But there is a lot that's not captured, actually. And to me, this is the most important part. So that's why I call this part, this next class part, leaving the game. So what's left out by this game model? Why the description of gameplay or this gameplay model is incomplete as a phenomenological description, phenomenological analysis of the participants. Now, we go back to the issue of freedom. We have, I'll put both of them on. Two kinds of freedom, two kinds of distancing from the game that are necessary in order to start the playful interaction, or in order to continue the playful interaction. There is this moment, right, in your installations in which the organism, and I will willfully revert back to the previous terminology, the organism, that is the willful participant, becomes a player. I mean, the moment in which the organism enters the play space or the tea garden and starts to act as a player. There is a distance there between the organism and the environment, which allows the organism to experience the tea garden as a playful environment. That moment, that freedom from the game, as I call it here for short, is prior, logically and temporally prior to the game itself, is pre-required. There is also a different kind of freedom which actually happens during the game, in which while you're playing, and I think this is what happens with the professional dancers, right? There are decisions to shift the interaction with the rules to a different level. At that point, there is a distancing. That is, players, the professional dancers, as we saw in the movie, here understand that there is some kind of rule-like regularity between their actions and the background, but they decide to ignore it. At that moment in which the decision is taken, is not part of the game itself, right? It's, in a certain sense, part of a different game, perhaps, but certainly not part of that particular game they were playing. There is a freedom from the rules, I've called it here, when the players play with the game, they take in the game as a whole, I think the environment as a whole, and they decide to change their attitude with respect to it. So they play not the game, but they play with the game. So this is what I call the basic antinomy of gameplay. Kind of was those titles, perhaps. We are never in a game unless we see it as such. We can only see it as such when we are not in it. That's why this distancing that's required by the game-like behavior is not actually captured by it. It rests upon something else that comes before it in the temporal sense and logical sense in the first, the top sense of freedom, but also it rests upon a continuous substratum of distancing. I'm using the gerundio here on purpose. It is while playing, there has to be the possibility of stopping the playing interaction and doing something else, and interact with the game at a different level, like the professional dancers were doing. So, limit, the basic fundamental limit of the gameplay model is that the acceptance of the game depends on, requires a fundamentally non-dudic component, a receptive distance, and actually a receptive distancing in a certain sense during the game itself. Now, the bold claim here is that passivity is the name that we give precisely to this distance and distancing that's required by the game model. Now, passivity, as I said, is the pre-required component that's needed, this kind of fundamental receptivity to the game or to the rules of the game. However, here and here, I cannot go into this at all. The problem, as soon as you start naming passivity, is that there are different ways in which you can understand the term passivity. The kind of most common way of understanding the term passivity is precisely the one that we do not want to use. And it's quite clear from the action perception loop model, in which the passivity of the organism with respect to the environment is just inverted activity or reactivity, as we call it. You are passive with respect to the environment because you act. Your action has certain effects, and you take those effects back in through your own perception. And well, I'll skip this other part because this is what Helga was supposed to be talking about. There are different kinds of this reactivity, of passivity interpreted as reactivity in the action perception loop, according to the different level of analysis. Instead, the playful passivity, to come up with a name that's just going in the train today, is what we want to insist on. Internal passivity required by playing game. That is, I want to make a distinction here, or just sketch the distinction between two different kinds of this playful passivity, which reflect the two different kinds of freedom that I was hinting at before, freedom from, freedom to. One I call internal passivity, required by playing game. That is the kind of passivity which, using Nietzschean terminology here, amounts to renouncing the freedom of the will within the play experiences. That's the kind of passivity you see exhibited by the child on the swing. Is the freedom of the man who wants to die, again, to use the Zarathustrian terminology. And the external passivity, instead, which has to come in order to accept the game as such. Accepting the game as such, receiving it as a game or as a play space. Now, the questions on which I will conclude, we'll perhaps maybe talk a bit about that, about those at dinner. The concluding questions are: one, is this concept of receptive passivity or playful passivity adequate to capture the remainder of the interaction in the tea garden that's not captured by the previous model? Or is this just one more step, but not the last one? Once I provide a philosophically adequate description of what is necessary in order to enter the game, or enter the space as a play space, one. And two, once I provide a philosophical adequate description of what is necessary in order to shift from obeying the rules to playing with the rules, is that all there is to say with respect to the tea garden but also with respect to other kind of experiences, other kind of installation that you guys have built. And the second and last question, I'm going to end on this one, is it possible to tweak the existing installation, the work you have done, or to design new ones in order to foreground this receptive passivity that we postulate as necessary in order to have a phenomenologically rich experience within them. And I think that what Chris was presenting actually gave me some ideas on how to perhaps reflect on the experiences of those participants and try to extract some philosophical ideas. That's all.
Interesting reaction to this last issue. We did an installation in London called Tight Whirling Circle before secondary, which was a totally play-at-play space. We just had fun with it. It was a gigantic white bouncy castle, with this kind of things I use for children's birthday card parties. Except we made one that was 25 meters long, 25 meters square, from 35 to 25 meters. And put it in this gigantic 50-meter room, and flooded it with light and loud music, and invited people to play in it as a kind of instant choreography. And the reason it was choreography was because, of course, they're standing on an inflated floor, and it's big enough so you could actually walk across it or run across it.
This was built for science illness.
Yeah, but it was interesting. It enabled people to really enjoy themselves in all sorts of interesting ways. But there was one particular group that was recalcitrant. It was 19-year-olds. So there was just no way that a 19-year-old was going to go in there and have fun with 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. And so it was an interesting issue because they weren't able to give themselves up to this experience, even though they could have had a great time too, because it was so antithetical to their sense of freedom or their sense of...
It was too playground-like.
I don't know. I think it was just that there were too many adults there. Too many children. They didn't want to be in either category.
But again, it goes back to this issue of closure and in an architectural sense. Is there also, like Teagarden, was no viewer. The viewer and the performer were equivalent. So it wasn't that they would be embarrassed that someone was watching them from outside. They were watching them inside while they play. So in a way that kind of levels the playing. To make a metaphor, levels the playing field that everyone has to play. And especially in Bouncy Castle, or try to bring a circle, whatever the hell it was called at the beginning, you couldn't remain on the sideline because you're always on this
the floor was moving all the time.
There was no place of standing away. And that's a big question that always comes up in designing any of these spaces is, do people enter and they're in it, or do they enter and it's some other place where they see it from a distance? So where are the... And that brings up the question, Stefano, I have about liminality. Like, where does the liminal fit into this scheme? Because the thing about Teagarden is that it's not just there are a number of different spaces to get to the quote Teagarden. What is the Teagarden? Is it that in that room where people come together? Is it that dressing room? Is it the hallway? There's all of these architectural boundaries in a way set up, just like in no theater, where they're in the dressing room and they stand in the mirror and they go down the hall.
Right, no, that's a very interesting part. My understanding was that these liminal spaces, as we rightly called them, are precisely what. They have a very important philosophical, so to speak, role. That is, they provide the closure. they are a transitional space in which you leave. In a certain sense, you are encouraged with very subtle environmental clues, right? I don't know exactly how you got professional dancers involved, but I imagine.
So they just came. We didn't know they were professional dancers. They revealed
the same process as everybody else. They weren't dressed.
Yes, they weren't dressed in any different way. They just revealed in the space that we actually can dance. We have professional dance background.
Right. So through all the different steps, and in a certain sense, it's actually interesting to me that the process of entering the what I call the playful space, which I was actually referring just to the room with all the sensors and stuff, right, is temporarily stretched. It's not immediate, right? You don't just step into it.
Yeah.
So there is some kind of preparation, which is very important at the psychological level.
Yeah.
You are dressed up. You are perhaps told a little bit about what goes on. So you are done with sensors and things. that allows you that adjustment. You know, it allows you to transform from an organism, using terminology, into a player. That's why I'm so
There
interested.
are no mirrors too. That's what's very interesting. There are no mirrors
Right.
where people can see what they look like.
So, you know, renouncing the freedom of the will in the absence of mirrors can amend Nietzsche in that sense. Right. Now, what I was saying is that I would be so interested in knowing more about environments which are not closed.
Well, Chris, you want to say something about sauna then? Because
Yeah.
see, we tried this experiment twice.
Well, no, it's interesting because
we did it in 2 versions.
unfortunately, Mr. Latour is not here because that's what we're trying to address in these 2 projects we proposed to his project at the ZKM, which is, and ironically, they didn't get it. I don't know if it's Latour who can get it, but because we said, no, we want people to, so there's 2 projects, Apparent Motion and Membrane. Sun is another one. These are projects which are not closed. They're not closed in the architectural sense. There's no liminality in that sense. It's that you walk and you encounter them. So you encounter, as you're walking through the exhibition hall, there's a bundle of bungee cords stretched in a space, or there's a screen that's dropped there. So you encounter yourself in the screen in terms of an image and the transformation of yourself, or you see people banging on these cords and they're making sound, you know. And so you walk right into that field, as Niklas was pointing out. And ironically, what the ZKM said is, we need to put these in special places because they're too loud or they're performances. And like, no, the whole point of conjuring this collective is to put it into a place where there is no closure, is it an encounter that you would encounter on the street. Now, the street, in the sense of a metaphor of the street being any open space that does not have that kind of closure that you're discussing. Sauna was another project which had also no
I think the one I had in mind was membranes.
Membranes is this kind of screen. Right, exactly. And Apparent Motion was
Now,
part of that.
can I ask you a question about this membrane? So, let's suppose that the kind of inborn intuition of the environment fails because you're not using the membrane to do anything. Right? The actual perceptual loop model fails as well. I don't know whether this is true or not, but because the environment is opaque, the membrane itself is opaque enough that you cannot learn from it.
It certainly fails in Teagarden. I mean,
And then the gameplay model fails as well because it's not closed. What happened at that point?
Okay.
How do people react to it?
Actually, it was a different scale, perhaps, which is the membrane could work locally, that is locally in time and energy, number of people with action perception in the sense of how to make it work. Okay, the idea for this is that you have a membrane dropped into the middle of an open space where other things are happening. Okay, and the membranes, they just maybe two arm's lengths wide. And then you see through it. It's important that you be able to see through it. You don't see yourself, you see through it. We do see an image of yourself. We actually see the other people through the membrane. That's why it's called the membrane. The action perception stuff is just so that if you wipe your hand, then you see the other person's image is changed. And it's changed in a predictable way. So you learn in a sense that way because through this kind of looping. But you don't actually operate on yourself or mirror. So you actually, with things, you operate on the other image of the other person. Now it's open. It's open in the sense it's dropped. This whole thing is dropped into the middle of the open space, which means it relies on people happening across it and just noticing that something happens as they pass by. There's not going to be any label telling them this is an interactive screen.
That's why it's an encounter that you encounter it. You don't.
So
you don't have this kind of set of affordances to move toward it.
No, it's in ZKM where people expect something to be interactive.
yes.
Well,
But now we're thinking of putting
But now we're thinking about it being in
now,
public.
the problem I came up with before was the sauna thing, is that we did sauna 2 versions. One was it's a tube, it was a special environment, people got slid into the tube and they saw this projection and it was supposed to be floated out of their body. It worked in that case, it was a sense of immersion. But the second time I think it was less sense of immersion because it was done very differently. It was what you saw, tubes suspended over the sidewalk and people just walking up and down the sidewalk. And first of all, it just wasn't bright enough, so there wasn't enough of a perceptual differencing between when they were on the sidewalk underneath the tube and when they were on the sidewalk just walking down the street. But that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to actually take this experiment, put outside in the street. I think basically it's an impossible task, but one possibility is maybe not so much talking about play space, but playful behavior. Is it possible to build a system which is open in this sense, in which or with which one can more readily engage in playful behaviors using the same repertoire everyday gestures that are using in that same space? That's a different requirement. It's weaker, right? It's weaker than immersive
Although I think
space.
it's going to be very difficult as well.
We just have a few moments for this. It's documented on video.
But I mean, I can think of another environment, Diller and Scafidio's blurb building, that also gets this distinction complicated, because at one point, I think this was an architectural installation in Switzerland made out of a platform over the lake that was then creates a cloud with 50,000 nozzles. So basically, people walk into a cloud. Now, from the outside, there's a surface in a sense. And then you put on a raincoat, and then again, there's the liminal, kind of transition space and walking down this ramp over the lake, and then you enter into this, this volumetric thing. But of course, there's no volume; it's just water. But it's all hissing and white noise, and you can't see anybody else. And so you're completely immersed in the sense of being immersed in the physical elements. You penetrate a surface and you enter into something which is not, physically. I mean, it's physically there, but it's, of course, there's no resistance to it. So, in that sense, it also, now the question is whether playful behavior emerges out of that, or whether it's just kind of entering into, the same thing as entering into a panoramic space, where you're immersed in an image that surrounds you, and you're awed by it, and you're in the center of that. Versus something like Tea Garden, where you can actually shape something. Now, and this question of shapeability comes into play as well. Or whether does play have to happen at that active level?
Yeah, my guess was that I didn't know about this environment. In that case, it's a symmetric situation with membranes. Yeah, here you're respecting closure, but you have no rules. So the environment is not responsive. Whatever you do, at that point you have very restrictive vocabulary. You can just move your body around, move around, exercise your senses. But the environment does not respond. It's in that sense deaf to your own actions. So that again prevents the playful behavior from happening.
It's interesting. It doesn't. It's so very interesting. This question about it's about there's a response, because in a way, like if you talk about the Damiris video, if you walk into that, in a way you do influence it at the levels removed, because the water vapor is being sucked out of the lake and sprayed in the air, and you diffuse the cloud by entering into it in some ways.
Well, the problem with the Damiris project, at some point it began to think too much in terms of specific action and reactions. That is, specific responses. Like if the person wears this kind of garment and has this kind of properties, then they will respond in a certain way. Yeah. There is a different kind of response, which is response at the level of physics. That is, if you, take all the technology away. If you put kids in a swimming pool with water and they don't know how to swim, there's no expertise, they will paddle and just throw water all around the place. Right. So the water is responding as physics. It's that space.
It doesn't have to be computational response.
It doesn't have to be also a explicit, what do you call, command, call.
Just quoting from one.
Exactly. And that can still be response.
But I want to go to this issue of complex rules, because I wonder if Shinwei was scratching his head there too. Because what's the distinction you make between rules versus constraints?
I was thinking of rules really in the games theoretic sense. Because whatever brings you from one state to the next.
But that presupposes that you know the direction, the state space of the game, and you know which direction the game will go.
Yeah. Yes, I think I know the direction we want to go. There is an interesting problem there, which is that the whole vocabulary of game theory and the vocabulary of a lot of theories that have been influenced more or less by game theory are basically discrete.
Yeah.
It's a discrete mathematics. In fact, Levi-Strauss, for example, is quite clear in a very old essay that he wrote, in which he actually says that the reason why mathematics and the social sciences has failed is because it's never been discrete mathematics. Now here we are experiencing, 50 years later, we're experiencing
the opposite, the backlash, right?
Yeah.
Now we hear the call for continuous mathematics
Right.
instead of discrete mathematics.
Yeah.
But of course, what he was thinking about at the time was statistics,
Yeah.
right? And measurable
Sure.
quantities. And so he was saying, no, we need group theory. And he actually mentioned 3 different theories. He mentioned communication theory, group theory, and game theory.
Yeah.
This is 45.
So it's coming out at the beginning of early cybernetics.
And of course, in game theory, it's basically discrete mathematics all the way. I mean, there have been extensions and trying to. So the interesting question is, can you have a continuous substratum and still use some of these apparatus, some of this conceptual terminology, or not? Can you partition a continuous, dimension in more or less discrete regions? That would be one way, a possible way of doing it. Or instead, you have to,
Isn't that the kind of tension that's in sport? We're dealing with physics at one level and then giving a discrete grid of rules. The sort of thing children are very recalcitrant about at first. And you say, well, no, you shouldn't do that. You don't do that with the ball. You don't go across this line. And they're just interested in basically the ballistics of the ball and playing, or like the ballistics of water or something like that.
But what about playing instrument, Joel? I mean, is that a wholly different situation? Is it to play music?
Like, what are the rules?
What's going on here?
That's what I was asking.
Is that even covered by
For
this?
constraint. There's a lot of constraints when you play an instrument, but what are the rules by which one?
Well, the rules are the history of music. But, the constraints are physics.
You're right.
Again, I think
Right.
it's the same two-layer system.
I think you do have the rules
In music.
in music.
Absolutely. And there's all kinds of discrete things. Scales and rhythms are all. There's all these boring numbers that are in between the interesting numbers.
And it's,
Yeah.
you don't have much fun, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's again this question of rules, because the presuppose that rules, as you said, don't necessarily have to be at the conscious level. So one may discover those rules as they play, right? Which is very different than a discrete, like with a game theoretic model, or even a sports model, where you say, okay, here's the coach marks out the grid, here's this. You know both the rules and the constraints of the game. That's very clear from the start.
And there's a tension between people who accept the rules and
And
people
don't.
don't, especially the 9-year-old Asia.
Although, this is something I always had to get a lot of trouble with, but
We get children.
it seems to me that the children, with children, including my own, people often say that children are recalcitrant to rule, like you just said. This is actually not my perception.
They're attracted to rules.
They are actually
rebellious.
they are recalcitrant, but not in the sense that they reject the rules. They are actually much more interested in talking about, in discussing the rules than they're interested in playing, especially when they are in that age between, let's say, 4 and 7, depending on how much team sports are done.
It's like German culture too.
So you see them spending 20 minutes deciding how to play hide and seek. How long should count, which hiding places are allowed, which hiding places are forbidden, and so on and so forth. They are incredibly sophisticated players in that sense. Anyway, we can go on. Should we call it a day?
Yeah, maybe we should
Continue. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we enjoyed ourselves, not bad. With our Inspector Uzo and company.
Yeah.